And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis here showing significant decrease in the ice there around Nunivak Island, especially back to the west, this area pushing back to the north under southerly winds and diminishing ice here all along the southwest coast, but still hanging in there over Bristol Bay. And that's going to continue to slowly do a slow fade here along the southwest coast as things continue to retreat back to the north a little bit over the next few days. On tonight's weather, windiest, wettest conditions here, of course, from the St. Lawrence Island area down across the southwest coastal areas, Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, they'll probably see the heaviest precipitation. Otherwise, next storm down there bringing storm and gale force winds here into the Aleutian, southern Bering Sea tomorrow, as this system kind of gets hung up here along the coast, keeping it wet in areas for the coast, warmer air spreading well to the north there, north of the Bering Strait, and rain down across Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula once again. And then we'll see for the next day, that big storm tracks back to the west a little bit, and a new low forms as a front progresses eastward, and that'll keep it wet and windy for the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, right on up with rain along the southwest coast, possible rain all the way up to St. Lawrence Island. Stays pretty good in the interior with that strong high pressure holding over western Canada, keeping it nice and dry over the southeast coast with light winds. And as you can see, light winds tomorrow for the central and south coast, east-northeast at 10 knots, not much different up north. Northeast to southeast, 10 to 15 knots maybe. North at 20 for Lynn Canal, 15 knots out of the north for Stevens Passage, back down to 10 knots for Clarence Strait. Northeast at 20 for Clarence Strait, though, on Monday. And now we're looking at small craft advisories for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal, north at 25 knots there. East winds 15 to 20 knots on the south coast, east at 10 to 15 knots on the north coast. Variable winds at 10 knots for Prince William Sound tomorrow. A little breezier, a little bit more of a breeze here for the North Gulf Coast, east-northeast at 15 to 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Barren Islands, east at 30, east winds 30, or east at 35, east winds 30 knots for Kamishak Bay, and Cook Inlet northeast 15 to 25. Northeast 20 to 30 knot winds for Cook Inlet on Monday, with 40 knot winds in the forecast for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, with east winds anywhere from 15 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast to 30 knots there south of Resurrection Bay and Prince William Sound. Winds staying light the next couple of days. On Monday, northeast at 10. Gale warnings for Kodiak Island for Sunday, as well as Bristol Bay. East winds 35 knots. And for the Alaska Peninsula, east-southeast winds 20 to 30 knots. And then good gales here for the peninsula on Monday, as well as Bristol Bay. Southeast winds, or east-southeast, east for Bristol Bay, southeast for the Alaska Peninsula, all at 40 knots. Kodiak Island gale warnings, east winds 35 to 40 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, on Alaska Island, east-southeast at 40 knots from Nikolsky all the way out here to Amchitka Island. Storm warnings for generally east winds of 50 knots and east 45 knots from Kiska to Shimia. And then for the next day, we've got gale force winds there for the western Aleutians at 35 to 45 knots, south 40 for Adak and Atka, and south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots there for the Fox Islands. And for the southwest coast, gale warnings, southeast winds 35 to 40 knots, east at 30 for the Pribilof, southeast 25 St. Matthew Island, gale warnings for the Yukon coast and Yukon Delta coast, and St. Lawrence Island, southeast 35 there, east 35 in Norton Sound. And 30 knot winds out of the east for Norton Sound, east winds 35 knots for St. Lawrence Island and Yukon Delta coast. Storm warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, southeast at 50 knots Monday, and then southeast winds 35 to 40 knots there for the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, eastern and central, actually the western, the entire Arctic coast tomorrow, east winds 15 to 20 knots, and the Chukchi Sea gale warnings for mostly east winds at 35 knots. And then for Monday, east-southeast winds 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea, southeast 15, western Arctic coast, central coast, light south winds at 10 knots, and light east-southeast breeze at 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coastline.